another faction in the Trump administration, isn't it? Of course, that is the kosher Nostra. That is the people around Bibi Netanyahu and the people that Trump, basically has in common with Bibi Netanyahu, including his own son-in-law. And we had a couple of stories on this kosher Nostra connection to Donald Trump this week. One was published here at henrymcco.com. Henry's a very interesting thinker, of course. He's another Canadian who was driven out of his university for being politically incorrect, and has been doing interesting alternative media work ever since. And these two stories, this one and the next one, which was the Politico story about the same topic, which was, by the way, written by this character, Ben Schlesinger, or Schreckinger, whatever his name is, who was the same guy who was trying to blame veterans today for being a Russian patsy. But this was a pretty good story, actually, reasonably good for mainstream. And it points out that this Hasidic Jewish movement, the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which is apparently a kind of a spin-off from Hasidic Judaism that's not recognized as Orthodox by the other Orthodox Jews, is huge in Russia. And it's been kind of very central, or at least overlapping with the Russian Jewish mob, that is the Kosher Nostra, which is by far the biggest and nastiest mob on earth, as we learned in this great book I just read a couple of weeks ago, Tony, called Red Mafia, by a guy named Robert Friedman, who's a Jewish American who probably paid for his research with his life. So this information is so important, and yet really it's weird, isn't it, that the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, these people who are going after Trump will not go after this, because maybe they're more or less part of the same Kosher Nostra.
Well, I'd have to say that these stories that we've been doing over 3 weeks now on Putin, the Jewish mafia in Russia, in the United States, and now we narrow it down to something called Chabad Lubavitch. Chabad Lubavitch. How am I doing with that?
That's probably close enough. I'm not really a Yiddish speaker myself, so
But this has agencies. This has outlets in 1,000 cities. It's very strong in Russia, and it's very strong in the United States. Jared Kushner is a big part of it. Donald Trump is a big part of it, and Vladimir Putin is a big part of it. And this started to come to light on that book that you referred to. We we covered a story about the book, Robert Friedman's book, Red Mafia, which is kind of the Cold War background to what's going on now. Mm-hmm. And in reading these articles and other ones that I linked to because this story is so fascinating, you start to see a picture of all Donald Trump's real estate deals, and this Simeon Mogilevich is very important in the earlier stage of this story. But then we have Roman.
By the way, he's the guy who, stop. He's probably the guy who killed Friedman.
Roman Abramovich is like Putin's mentor, and so it turns out Putin is indeed been cultivated by the Russian billionaires, and he's unfriendly with some and friendly with others, and the ones with whom he's friendly are part of this Chabad Lubavitch organization, as is Trump. And we've got to go into this. I noticed that Magna International, Frank Stronach, who has a lot to do with the automotive industry in Canada, he's part of this whole network. It's a fascinating story. Felix Sater and his Bayrock group, saved Trump's real estate empire, and it's all involved with the mob and the gambling casinos and such and such. And I have to say that these stories are significantly transforming my geopolitical understanding of the contemporary situation these days. Mm-hmm. Look into this.
That's right. And a shout out to the team at Veterans Today that was on top of this Russian mob connection to Donald Trump long before anybody else was, that I saw anyway. We were harping on this during the entire campaign.
And it's just round the clock on CNN and NBC on Trump and Putin and Russia and fixing the election, and don't touch this deep state side of the story.
Never mention the Russian mafia. It's disgusting. I mean, the mainstream can't even report on organized crime. I guess they are organized crime.
They are organized crime.
And speaking about organized crime, how about the Crimes of Zion, our ever popular category about horrendous behavior out of Israel? Here we have a rundown of the Israeli leaders who want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the oldest and greatest Islamic architectural monument. It's been in the sacred space of Palestine pretty much ever since Islam existed, that they want to blow it up and create a blood sacrifice temple in its place. And so this article from the Electronic Intifada gives us a rundown on these maniacs who want to start World War III by destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque and slaughtering pig heifers and babies or whatever else they slaughter in there. Yehuda Glick is one of their ringleaders. He held a temple movement emergency session in the Knesset recently, and the attendees included Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, who calls for genocide against Palestinians quite openly, Bensi Gopstein, who is part of this movement called Lehava, that is basically threatening any Jews who have the temerity, nay, the audacity to actually marry a non-Jew. They're going to come after you if you try that. So these people are fanatical, creeps. And unfortunately, they have a tremendous amount of power in Israel.
Yes, this is blood-curdling, frankly, to read this through. I heard it said by a Mohawk friend of mine that the highest level of politics is religious politics, and the politics going on what Jews refer to as the Temple Mount, which Arabs refer to as Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock, what the takeover, the very rapid aggressions directed at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the apparent efforts to eject Muslims from this holy site to take it over and begin construction of the third temple. I mean, this has cosmic implications in Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem is a core of the monotheistic religions, all the monotheistic religions. And when you read what Yisrael Ariel, the things he says, like, we will conquer Iraq and Turkey and get Iran. Different politicians say the temple is the ID card of the people of Israel. The movement to take over this site and to begin the construction of the throne to govern the world at the end of the world in the prophesied times when the Messiah's return and the different traditions. And, this is something that, for instance, Latter-day Saints, Mormons are very much into this. Baha'is are very much into this. This is really the pinnacle of politics being waged in religious terms, which is the extremism is rampant in this situation.
Well, it sure looks to me, Tony, like the people who want to destroy Al-Aqsa and build a blood sacrifice temple in its place and put the Messiah on the throne to rule the world from Jerusalem, that so-called Messiah for them is going to be the Antichrist for everybody else. But let's move on.
And what about the Mahdi?
Well, yeah, okay. The short version here, Tony, is that universal monotheists, and that includes Christians, Muslims, and quite likely some liberal Jews, see any kind of messianic figure as someone who would treat everyone equally and make the world great for everybody, including lions lying down with lambs and things like that. Whereas the tribal monotheists, and that includes these lunatics, as well as, I would say, an awful lot of the so-called Jewish people in Israel, the Jewish Zionists, those people have a history of seeing their Messiah as being a military conqueror who subjugates the so-called Goyim, or the other tribes, for the Jews, who will then rule the world, and their military leader will be their Messiah, and he will shed blood of all of these Goyim as he conquers them, and the world will be great after they've set themselves up as ruling it. So it's the universal monotheists versus the tribal monotheists. The tribal monotheist version of the Messiah is clearly the Antichrist for everybody else. Let's move on to, we have more horror stories out of Israel, though.
Right.
So we got to cover these. This one that blew my mind. My wife actually found this one for me. They have like a Disney World type thing in Israel, in the occupied territories, where instead of seeing like androids of presidents that give speeches, like in Disneyland, here you have like androids of Arabs that you can murder, and it looks like a real murder. You blow them away with guns and they bleed and stuff. For $115, you can kill a pretend Arab in one of these Disneylands in Israel. This is beyond mind-blowing. Can you imagine, Tony, if somebody tried to create a Disneyland thing like this where you murder Jewish people for fun for $115 to blow away a Jewish-looking person? I mean, this is disgusting.
I'm speechless, frankly. I don't know what to say about this. It's just so startling and telling and thoroughly indicative of the trouble we're in as humanity.
Indeed. 15,000 to 25,000 tourists visit these camps and pretend to murder Arabs for $115 per murder. And the vast majority are American Jews, according to this report. And do you think
people think they deserve it because, well, after all, didn't Arabs and Muslims do 9/11?
That probably has something to do with it. But, of course, nobody thinks about this kind of the incredible, off-the-charts bigotry exemplified by this story. But we have Breitbart, run by these neocons and neocons in disguise like Steve Bannon, who are saying that the pro-Palestinians are the racists. They're the anti-Semites. They're the Holocaust deniers, blah, 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 blah. What a bunch of nonsense.
These stories out of Breitbart suggest to me that Bannon is being pushed farther and farther away. Bannon, of course, he was the webmaster of Breitbart. And so these stories emphasizing that the Scottish pro-Palestinian people are really using their pro-Palestinian position to secretly get together and hate Jews and deny the Holocaust. This is the tenor of this story, and isn't it interesting that if you do take the human rights of Palestinian people, you face these kinds of accusations?
Okay, well, and you're likely to have your free speech rights attacked.